Orians. It's good to have you here as part of this meeting. I want to start out by asking you about your background. How were you trained in the science, and what were the steps in your scientific career?
Well, I'm one of the people that started out as a boy naturalist. And I started out bird watching when I was 7 years old, and I still have little notebooks going back to when I was 9 years old of the birds I saw. And then I decided I was going to be a zookeeper, and I made big lists of animals that I was going to keep in my zoo. And somewhere about when I was perhaps 13 years old, I made a very momentous discovery, and that was that people got paid for doing this. And so I knew then that I was going to go on to the university and be a zoology major, as I perceived it then, and be a professional biologist sort of concentrating on birds. So that's how I got started. Of course, I didn't have any idea what that meant and what I was getting into as a kid, but I knew where I wanted to go. Then I was very much molded during my education by a Fulbright fellowship I had a year spent in England, working with David Lack at the Edward Gray Institute of Field Ornithology in Oxford. And he introduced me to evolutionary thinking in ecology and the role of hypothesis testing. And that was a big turning point in how I looked at the field, and that's sort of carried with me ever since. So that's been probably the major theme. I've worked on the relationships between evolution, ecology, and behavior ever since.
Can you give us a small example of a really early project that you did that shows how all these pieces fit together?
Probably the first thing where I put them together was my doctoral thesis, in which I compared the social organization of two species of blackbirds in California that are almost identical, the red-winged blackbird and the tricolored blackbird, one of which defends territories and the individuals are widely spaced, the other of which is densely colonial. And I tried to understand how, from a common ancestor, these had so diverged in their social systems and how that related to the kind of environment that they were exploiting. And I made some speculations about that in my thesis. So that was the first time I tried to put that together to relate social systems to environmental conditions.
It seems that pretty soon in your career you started working on a lot of different kinds of organisms and a lot of different kinds of situations. How did that come about?
Well, I've worked mostly on birds, and that's been the one theme that has carried through. But as I continued on in my career, I started doing some work with insects. I published on slugs. And then I've done some work in plant ecology and plant-animal interactions and chemical defenses. But it just sort of unfolds, and in parts driven by the kind of graduate students that come to work with you and the interest they have, and you get caught up in it. And graduate students have been a very important component of my career.
And you train graduate students at university? Which university?
I've been at my entire career at the University of Washington in Seattle. I did my doctoral dissertation at UC Berkeley, turned in my thesis and drove to Seattle, and have been there ever since.
That's a great natural area, and where there's a lot of theme of interest in the environment. Do you think it's very easy to get people and students in that region of the country interested in this kind of topic?
It's quite easy. As a matter of fact, the movement of university education courses, other things, into conservation issues and land management issues has been probably student-driven more than anything else. And even now in the departments, you'll find that the strongest interest in that is among the graduate students who want to at least devote part of their professional lives to trying to deal with the pressing environmental problems that society faces. And so they push the faculty, I think, quite a bit.
Today, the title of your, or during this meeting, the title of your talk is going to be Behavior, Ecology, and Evolution. What are you going to talk about?
Well, I'm going to try to talk about the relationships between behavior and ecology and how they have evolved, as the title would suggest. The general conceptual framework for the talk is a phrase that was coined by this country's leading ecologist of the past century, G. Evelyn Hutchinson, and he talked about the ecological theater and the evolutionary play. And so, and of course, the players in the evolutionary play are behaving in various sorts of ways. So much of what we see in the structure and functioning of ecological communities and the way populations work the result of the behavior of thousands and thousands of individuals making decisions about where to settle, what to eat, who to mate with, these sorts of things, the fundamental decisions that organisms make. And so what I'm exploring is, in my talk, is our understanding of how those decisions are made. What is the role of genetics and how those decisions are made? What is the role of experience and how little, in fact, we understand about the interaction of those two to result in an integrated adult organism that makes decisions that results in it surviving reasonably well and having kids out there in a tough world. Then I'm going to turn to some issues of how behavior then influences the structure of ecological communities and the kind of things that we see there. And I will end up talking about how we determine the long-term course of evolution. I mean, the factors that are maintaining a particular kind of behavior today aren't necessarily the ones that caused it to evolve in the first place. How do we figure out the longer-term evolutionary history of these behaviors that leads us to where we are today? And during the course of this, I will manage to talk about our own behavior, which is probably one of the biggest challenges of all.
It must be very tempting for you to take everything you know and use it to interpret human behavior. Are we that simple?
Well, it's not that we're that simple, but the tools of evolutionary biology are useful to apply to thinking about human behavior. I mean, humans are different than other organisms. We're quite different in some very important respects, particularly in our behavior, which is where we're more different than in our physiology is pretty normal. But the behaviors where we're dramatically different from other organisms. So you can't just simply apply models from other organisms onto human beings, but the kind of process that we go through in developing hypotheses and testing them in behavioral ecology are very fruitfully applied to human behavior. But you got to think about people and not just about blackbirds or insects or something. That they may guide how you think, but they can't guide you in detail.
Meyer, in his comments this morning, talked about these two different levels of evolution. The simple evolution that systematists may study, and then this group evolution of large systems. You must deal with a lot of complexity in your work.
Yes, most of the work that I do deals with the sort of what we might call the complexity end of the spectrum. My work on social organization and how it relates to the environment, to understand the individuals that are interacting, their success is influenced by what other individuals are doing, whether or not they're related to them, and how closely. And then as we rack that up or ratchet that up to thinking about ecological communities, it gets even more complex. So much of my work and much of what I will talk about in my talk tomorrow relates to how we move to understanding those complexities better from some very useful building blocks that we've accumulated at the simpler level of understanding the behavior of organisms.
Over the past 100 years, what was the most significant finding in your field, and how did it influence your work?
Interesting. Behavioral ecology has been a field in which, until relatively recently, most of the advances were not driven by technology and not by some new methods. They were driven conceptually as our understanding of evolution got better, and as we understood the role of larger social groups, as Ernst Mayr pointed out in his talk this morning, that we have not only just selection on the individual, but selection on these larger groups. And that has been probably the single most important new element added into the study of behavioral ecology. With respect to the longer-term evolution, the major advance that is revolutionizing what we're thinking about now does happen to be a technological one, and that's the ability to do phylogenetic analyses using a rich array of morphological, behavioral, and molecular characteristics, and with the availability of powerful computers to do the analysis, which you couldn't do before. So the abilities to gather new data and computational abilities are having a major effect now, but that's mostly in the last 20 years.
Your work really depends on integrating a lot of different fields. What kind of fields have influences?
The fields that I draw upon most heavily in my own work are, of course, ecology, both at several levels: behavioral ecology, which is where I've done most of my work, but then there's population ecology, looking at population dynamics, and then community ecology, putting it all together. So those are three elements of ecology that are tremendously important. And then there's neurobiology, because actually how does the nervous system work? How do animals actually come to make the right sort of decisions? So you have to have some knowledge of neurobiology and genetics. I use a lot of biogeography, a field in which I've taught, in interpreting the structure of things, because there's the long shadow of history across where different organisms evolved and where they've moved that is reflected in the patterns that we see today. So I have to bring that into into consideration as well. So it involves a fair bit of integration.
You live in a region of the country, the Pacific Northwest, that has gone through a lot of turbulence over environmental issues. Are you involved? I think that you've done work on environmental aesthetics. What's that, and how does that relate to environmental science?
Well, the environmental aesthetics naturally grows out of my interest in behavioral ecology, and I got interested in it based on my work on habitat selection in birds, how you pick where you're going to do things. And it occurred to me that some of the ideas and methods that I was using for studying habitat selection in birds could relate to how people select where to do things and how we respond to landscape features, tree shapes, flowers, these sorts of things. So that led me into thinking about landscape aesthetics and trying to explore the potential evolutionary roots of why we find certain scenes beautiful, why we find certain tree shapes beautiful, why we think flowers are wonderful, why we give flowers to people on various occasions, behavior that on the face of it is a bit surprising. It's only not so surprising because it's so common, and therefore we're used to it happening. So that's how I got into the environmental aesthetics issue. Also, other environmental issues that are partly aesthetic are very important in the Northwest. That's how we're treating the old-growth forests. And right now, the really hot issue is salmon and salmon recovery, which has both economic and strong aesthetic components, because salmon are an icon for the Pacific Northwest, and there are people who care about that salmon still run up the rivers. You know, it's an aesthetic sort of feel rather than just the economics, which are also important. So most environmental issues actually have an aesthetic or ethical component. The Endangered Species Act, for example, is fundamentally an ethical statement. It basically says nice people don't cause other species to go extinct. You know, that's in essence what the law says, and there's a lot of other embellishment of that, but it's really an ethical statement. And to the extent that it says, and you shouldn't, in deciding to help preserve species, economics shouldn't be the consideration of whether you ought to list and try to do something about it. It's the right thing to do, whatever the economics. And so that's ethics. And so that's involved in almost everything we do in relation to the environment, because stewardship is an ethical issue.
That's wonderful. What's your outlook for our world based on these ideas?
Well, the only way that I know to live is to have hope. Because unless you think there's something we can do about it and that you can make as an individual some contribution to it, you don't do anything. And so I can't live in any other way other than feeling that it's worth the struggle, and that I can look at my grandkids and say, whatever happens, I tried. So, and there are encouraging signs amidst a lot of discouraging signs too. And so there's enough to keep one going through a lot of the discouragement that inevitably accompanies thinking about and trying to deal with environmental problems.
Where do you see your science going in the future?
I think, Ernst Mayr, in his saying what the three great challenges in the future were, captured a lot of what's in the field I deal with. He said, the central nervous system is clearly a major challenge for future research, because the brain is probably the most complicated single organ. I view this not as just the human brain, of which we're especially interested, of course, but other organisms have very interesting brains that are rather differently wired than ours, and they can do remarkable things that we can't do. So that looking at, there's birds that can navigate using polarized light, and there's all sorts of things that animals can do that we can't. So that when I look at the central nervous system, I'm not just thinking about the human brain, however interesting that may be. And then, as Dr. Meyer said, trying to put all this together to understand how complex ecological systems work, that's basically what my work leads into, and I am slowly, very slowly, working on a book to try to integrate some of these levels of ecological thinking to eventually show ways that I think we can better use behavioral ecology and population ecology in getting a handle on the complexities of ecosystem ecology.
What are the challenges to science as a whole in our near future?
Well, there are a number of challenges in the biological science. One is, of course, that to try to stem the tide of extinctions, because we're losing the raw material of our field on a daily basis. And so and once a species is extinct, it's gone forever. So this is not among the damages that one can reverse. This is an irreversible thing, so it's terribly important. Then we need to fully understand the evolutionary relationships of these organisms, and we've got these powerful new techniques now that enable us to develop believable phylogenies for the first time in the history of biology. And then we can use this information about phylogenetic relationships to deal with a whole array of problems. Sir Ian showed a couple of those in dealing with the conservation of rare plants. Knowing the evolutionary relationships is terribly important. That's very important for all sorts of conservation issues. And it's also very important then for being able to tell how often different kinds of social systems, for example, have evolved, which is a question that I'm interested in and we'll talk a bit about tomorrow.
I want to thank you for a fascinating interview with Dr. Orians, and I look forward to hearing your presentation.
It's a pleasure being with you.